And now I just feel a need to say a little bit about the Embassy Berry and its significance to us tonight. I hope you saw it, docked at our neighbor David Spire's dock next door. Those of you who visit the Mystic Seaport are used to seeing it there, but for our special celebration tonight, it was brought downriver. It will go back up on Monday morning. 50 years ago, there was movement to begin a historical society in Noank. And Paul Stubing, which is a name those who have been around for a long time will remember, he heard that the Embassy Berry was around and had the idea of getting the Embassy Berry to come to help kick off the beginning of the Noank Historical Society in July, I think the 3rd or 4th of 1966. And that came to pass, the Embassy Berry. She had been launched 100 years prior. She was built in Noank at the Latham shipyard at the end of Latham Lane and named for the owner's 7-year-old daughter, Embassy Berry. They were Noank people. It was a Noank fishing boat and well built and lasted. And I'm told it's the only remaining one of its type in the country. I believe it's on the National Registry. And so it's very special. But she was brought here for her 100th birthday, which was the time of the founding of this society. So it is the 150th birthday of the Embassy Berry, built here in Noank, and the 50th anniversary of the Noank Historical Society. So if you didn't get a look, take a look before you leave, perhaps in the moonlight. Our speaker tonight is Steve Jones, and I suspect most of you know him. I'm not going to give a lengthy introduction, simply going to say he's a professor of English at UConn and Marine Studies, knows Noank and the surrounding waters very well, surrounding boats, and as well as being a UConn professor, he's an author of a number of books and general entertainer of whoever's sitting on at the counter at Parsons. So we feel honored to have him here tonight to share some of his recollections with us.
They've got me. Usually I can't hit that note.
Try again.
Try it again.
I lower it. No,
Hello.
don't try to hit the note.
Do what?
Talk.
Talk.
Yeah. Do your thing.
Yeah, okay. They've got me more wired up than Joseph Mad Dog Taborski on his last night. Thanks. It's always a pleasure to get things right side up, to be here, particularly on this occasion of the great anniversary. People in the street have stopped me to Noank to say that I'm going to do the history of Noank. I think they got that by reading the something or other. Anyway, who would try to do that? I'm just trying to do one particular day, which is the 4th of July, 1966, which was the founding. And the place is Noank under the hill. You're sitting in it. I was going to have them project on the screen that image that's on the notice for the meeting, but you've seen that before. It's a wonderful drawing that Hansina made so you could see it a little bit better, of an old watercolor taken from, you might say, or drawn from the top of the hill. Okay, so let's start with this thing here. I have tried to write a somewhat coherent narrative here that brings in a lot of the stuff that was going on. So it's what we call a narrative, say. Okay, I'll begin with this. The 4th of July ought to be celebrated with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of the continent to the other, from this time and forevermore. Now, this stirring quote, John Adams writing to his wife Abigail, appeared in all of the Noank Historical Society promotions for its inaugural event. Only a few thought it a bit over the top, that business of guns, for instance, and there was the traditional reluctance on the part of the local clergy to be prodigal with bells. So some wondered who Adams was and why this fellow was sticking his nose in Noank affairs. And some other people said, why isn't he with his own wife on the 4th of July? You have to think about that for a minute. Mort Wright was a history major, so he pointed out that Adams later became president of the United States, and as for that matter, so did his son. And Adams, in this letter from Philadelphia to Boston, was doing nothing less than inventing how our nation would henceforth celebrate the 4th of July. Is this too loud? It sounds like I'm banging off the wall here. No, okay. Okay, Wright thought this was the kind of thing an historical society ought to know if it were to be more than a mere exercise in preserving the purity of one's ancestral lines. You see that in a lot of historical societies. They're in there working away and say, we okay? We all right? We're okay? We fortunately, I think, have a balance between that sort of thing and other things. We're now all heirs actually to the Age of Enlightenment, that John Adams was a product of that. Now, it did not occur to me at the time that illuminations might mean pyrotechnics, fireworks being, in my experience, something that they did at nearby Groton Long Point. As for where the rockets might come down, I was of the Werner von Braun school of it not being my department where they come down. That was a popular record at the time by Tom Lear. I was more concerned with Noank under the hill, which to my mind was governed not so much by the Noank Historical Society, which of course didn't exist at that moment, but the iconic presence of Noank lobsterman Antonio Pezzolesi. How many of you knew him? Great. Now, Noank under the hill was and is that section of the village in the foot of Store Hill surrounded in the public pump. In other words, right here. The retired fisherman lived back of me at that time, his porch suspended over my backyard as if it were a balcony in an opera house. I think that sort of got to him. Color is part of what happened here. The street hill rose up under his house like a breaking wave. This meant that his best view of the sea would be from the little red building up to which I'd seen him struggling every morning in his green and black buffalo plaid overshirt. I'm not saying this is the same one, but I did buy it at the Noank Historical Corner Closet a few years ago, and it only had one button. We put some more on it. It's possible. Okay. He would be puffing on his corncob pipe like a steam engine, and he always left the door open so you could see the smoke curling aloft. For years, I erroneously thought it was what it eventually became, a garden tool house. Seen independently of his outhouse, he was a small gnarl of a man, made more so by what must have been a lot of bad weather at sea. Prior to his ascent to the shed, he now began each morning with a hobble past my house to the town landing, a trek which he managed with the help of a crooked stick. I used to have that stick. I don't know where it went. It was in early morning light, he reminded me of Sophocles' riddle man on 3 legs, and the wooden one was no straighter than the flesh. In fact, so striking was this tableau that there was a movement afoot to have a sculpture made to capture his image forever. The site would be the very spot where the old lobsterman had his morning moment evaluating the harbor. You go down there and see if it's going to still be there. But think of the statue, this one here, at Gloucester. How many of you have seen that? It's right there, yeah. Okay, it's this guy here. We had this sort of thing in mind. The original, of course, was bigger. This is actually Clayton Longspar Morrissey at the helm of Arethusa. He was the model for that. So we thought we'd use Tony down here. Same idea. Except we'd have a lobster pot instead of the wheel of the schooner. Lest you feel this is a vain dream of aesthetes, we had a sculptor already lined up, a top-notch man in Edgar Zell Stever IV, whose son was the harbor master and lived halfway up the hill opposite Tony, so he had plenty of chance to watch this. Now, Edgar Zell IV, the sculptor, he did work for his whole life, beautiful stuff. At Lafayette College, is in the form of a panther. Just looking at the picture, it's scary, the little thing ready to go. You can see better examples close up, actually, if you go through your pockets for the Virginia Quarter, because he did that one, John Smith's 3 ships for the Virginia Quarter. He did that when he was over 80 years old. And the fact that we were not able finally to get him to do that, he was going to do it just for the price of his expenses. Should have done that. We had a place all set up for him, but finally, he ran out of what we all run out of. Yeah, anyway. Now, as for the subject of this statue, the actual unbronzed old lobsterman himself, most weathers there was a perpetual green and black buffalo plaid overshirt. Usually you see these red and black in whiskey ads and so forth. On windy days, you'd look up on the balcony to see him dancing, a remarkable tarantella, it seemed, a parody of a Mediterranean. This thing would be jumping around up on the clothesline. This gives me a chance to take this off. Yeah, like this. You look up there and see that. Okay. If I were a stripper, I'd throw that in the audience, wouldn't I? Yeah. Where's the music? Okay. He had indeed a frisky side. One of his elfin schemes was to position himself on his front balcony, the better to advise blundering tourists seeking Abbott's lobsters. The place out-of-towners sought for the authentic Noank lobster experience. Nothing panicked these citizens more than the sight of actual water. And seeing such a phenomenon suddenly dead ahead, they would slam on the brakes, and there he would be, complacently smoking his cigar. The cigar butts would later be ground up and put into the pipe. Anyway, the proper response to, down here in Lower Noank, for where's Abbott's would be...
Top of the hill, turn left on Pearl Street.
Could you all hear that?
The ferry dock.
Top of the hill and turn left, right. Van Zant's down here provided that. Okay. Okay, you can go home now. What Tony would say is, down the hill, you've got to wait for the ferry. Then he'd feign consulting his watch. 25 minutes. On the balcony, more privately, he was a repository of the gamier side of village history, not really the sort of stuff the brand new Noank Historical Society was ready for yet. Some of his little stories were like this. Exactly how that old man stumbling by with a white cane, how he lost his eyesight. Actually, it was from skunks. Longer story, of course. And he talked about the ruined house across the street where the rat ate the baby. And the bushes where rum runners stashed their load, and how they bought his silence. And the fisherman at the north end dock over here, who would drown your cat for $5, and then keep the $5 that was supposed to be for the chloroform, spend it on booze, and just use more rocks. He would also castrate the tomcat. He'd do that for nothing because he'd be annoyed. He was usually hungover. And the cat that mostly, to his wrath, lived in the house right over there. It's been since taken down so he can relax. And then one of the more sensational stories, I was talking to Andrew Blacker about this, who found a pistol in his backyard down in the garden, was a story Tony had about a guy being shot right there at that town pump. He was a boyfriend of Madeline Spink, who owned the house that we had bought. And he would, a lot of back and forth between New York and Noank because of the fishermen and South Street, that sort of thing. A lot more connection there than, we'll say, Hartford. Who needed Hartford, right? Yeah. Okay, along with the austerity bred by his immigration days, Tony, the hard times in the country that followed, he cultivated a gaudy defiance. He planted a row of junior prom corsages, which put to shame the unpainted pickets that separated our lots. Whose job it was to paint that fence, I don't know, but anybody who did would have been trampling the chrysanthemums. The chrysanthemums in evening light like this would vibrate in chromatic bliss. It's quite lovely. My task was to finish building my lobster pots. Becoming a lobsterman was one of the driving ideas between moving to Noank now that I'd gotten out of the military obligation. Lobstering was one of the things my grandfather had taught me when I was a kid at Groton Long Point. Having moved into the Noank house in the late winter, I had not much conversation with the old fellow on the balcony, but now I began hammering away. He became my daily observer. Eventually, he asked me where I kept my boat. I said, Groton Long Point, and prepared for an attack on the frivolity of summer people. Groton Long Point. Groton Long Point. Goddamn Portuguese crook, they steal your gear. Holy shit. I asked him when was the last time he was over there. He said he dug all the foundations over there. $50 lots. He spat that perotti thing he would smoke down into the junior prom flowers. I said the taxes were $5,000 a year. $5,000, $50 lot. All sand, no good for anything but tomatoes. As for stealing my gear, they were to throw me out a few weeks later for running a lobster business. My hero at that time was Ernie Abbott, who was right across the way, and he was a genuine lobsterman who actually caught lobsters until his boat ended up on the breakwater, hard turn down there. And then he had to get out of that, and then he had a whole garage full of them, and then they said, no, you can't do that there, and then he had to go to Noank, and one disaster after another until you have what you have today. But he was a real lobsterman. I said, yeah, sure, over in Venetian Harbor. Venetian Harbor, he says. You know Venice? Well, I tried to explain that was the name that the 1920s Groton Long Point developer had given the marsh they were dredging. Oh, yeah, sure, of course, I knew the real Venice, everybody does. The real Venice was bad Hemingway and good Thomas Mann. It was Antonio Vivaldi. It was Byron's Bridge of Sighs, Ruskin, Henry James. Oh, the gondolas and Dante. Sure, I knew Venice. On a more personal level, there was a wastebasket when I was a kid, had a picture of Venice on it, crawl around and check it out. Now, when I was done running off my second-hand Venetian credentials, it was time for him to launch another down below. He says, big harbor, right? The sun off the water behind me danced on his horn rims. I mumbled something. Ha! You never been there. Everybody say, big harbor, Venice. Everybody who never been there. Well, he had not read Hemingway or Byron. He had simply sailed into that harbor on a square rigger. They were smuggling raw silk in the cargo for accordions for the gondoliers. You had to know, he says, which button to push, B flat or whatever it was, and then it would open. The same thing, he says, with wine. There you tapped the cask and replaced what you stole with seawater. Venice was like that, all tricks. You had to do the stuff like that to make it all come out right, so low were the wages. Not even a big harbor. Though everybody always said so, you could learn a lot about people by how big they thought the harbor in Venice was. Hey, he called down one day from the rail. You no going to catch lobster in the backyard. Lobster is out in the water. Yeah, okay, a wise guy. I lived under his tutelage and began to catch on. Sometimes he meant to be funny, but also he had learned that most of his comments were colored by his having been the product of immigration and hard times. As he watched me build the lobster pots in the yard that spring, he favored me with a mixture of inside stuff and sarcasm. I was grateful for the tips because he made his living at this fishery, or at least enough of his living to go on with his other jobs and to raise 3 daughters and take care of his wife through a long terminal illness. 3 Sisters was the name of the boat. He called it a Sharpie, an open flat-bottomed skiff propelled by outboard. Not as I had first thought with the large sailing boats called by the same name. No, New Haven, he says, Sharpie. As I'd come to know him, he offered me a good many tips on how to make and rig the pots that I had not learned from my grandfather, who after all was an amateur. In those days, everybody used traps made out of wood. There's one up here. This is a fancy one. You see it in the old pictures as a round top. The ones we made were flat top. It's a lot of work to do those. And when they get busted up a bit, as they always do, to try to repair them by reaching inside. These are oak laths, and hitting those nails is practically impossible. But this is, an artifact now. It's like you show it to people and say, oh my, I wonder what that was. Okay. See the wire ones now out in Brownie's yard and so forth. Got those from Wilcox, the makings for them, the heads and so forth. Now, he knitted his own heads. I had his 2 needles here that he did, except I lost them in New London on Bank Street. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? Actually, it was at the museum over there. Some of you were there. We were doing a thing on Ellery Thompson. Those are actually belong to Tony Pasolese. Beautiful little needles that he made, the heads of the traps. And the hinges for them we got from the fire department out of their abandoned, surveyed hose, which as a member they kept those things for the lobstermen. The fire department was a good place in those days to learn lobstering. Orion Ford and Walter Johnson and I were sort of, believe it or not, in the same class. We all went different directions, but the problem was finding ballast, which of course you needed to sink the all-wooden traps. There seemed to be almost enough old bricks lying about. They were light for their size, but you could make them fit nicely in there. Other people began to pour concrete and other things like that, but ballast. Bait was another. That's less appetizing challenge. After looking at a bait barrel at first light for a number of years, I don't understand people who eat sushi. You could scrounge some of these bait from the draggers when they came in at the dock in Stonington. And just as the leaves were budding up in Crowley Brook and Paquatonic, Walt Johnson and I would go up there with hand nets and catch buckies or alewives and salt them down in old 25-gallon Vidal cans we get from Ray Coons. That's Ray's grandfather. Now, of course, it's Carl Shepard's. These we would store against the season's need, try to keep the raccoons out of them, back of Grace Johnson's chicken shed next to the Haley farm. Thanks to my friends in the Noank Fire Department, most of my work in the pots seemed to be passing my mentor's inspection. There remained the question of exactly where to place the pots. One day my mentor even offered me the ultimate. He would share with me his ranges. This is a breakthrough. He not only was talking about technique here, we're talking territory. I went back into my house and lugged out my chart of Fisher's Island Sound, H.O. Pub. What's the number? Nobody knows anymore, huh? It's on the thing up there. I forgot what it is myself. You must know. H.O. Pub, whatever it is, out here. I had that anyway. I still have it. I can't remember. Okay, the wind started shaking it around as I advanced towards his house. I could hear him bellowing on the other side of the flapping paper. I peered over the top. He was waving his hands as I advanced. He retreated. I kept on, allowing myself the distraction of the unruly chart, which I was attempting to subdue. By the time I had the damn thing furled, he was already back in his cellar. As his house was set on a hill, the basement was a walk-in, lit by regular sash windows on the side toward my house. Through the screen door, I could sense him backed up in the windows by his bench. "Hey," I said, peering in as I tapped on the rolled-up chart on the screen. "You were going to show me your ranges." I felt like a door-to-door salesman that had blown his opportunity. What was he saying? It wasn't just his mix of Italian and English. That he had learned pretty much to follow, if not exactly translate. A year or so later, I found him in an appendix of Mencken's American English under a thing called Italians Who Have Learned Their English from French Canadians. This is a chart, I explained. Fisher's Island Sound, the chart of the local waters. As I began to unroll it against the screen, he howled. Now that my eyes had adjusted a bit, I could see in the dim light he was back against the tomato plants on the bench. Each one was carefully stuck in its own tin can. I made a sudden connection. I said, you don't want the chart. I gave it the back of my hand, like, who needs a chart? I took it back. Be right back. I go back into my house, and I encounter my son. "What's up?" I said, "Captain Pasolese is showing me his ranges." "Stow this in the study, please." I got back. He was holding the screen door open. "Come in. I give you my ranges." His bench was 2 scaffold planks suspended on saw horses. He cleared a space by moving some of the tomato plants. There was good light from the window. "Here, gas buoy." He plopped a tomato pot down. "Gas buoy." He looked at me as if I'd said a very stupid thing. "Gas construction buoy." I nodded wisely. The gas part I was all right with. Old books on aids to navigation frequently talked of acetylene as fueling these lights. Construction part kind of threw me. I was thinking, what's being built out there? Well, there's no point in hassling every little thing. Let's see how this plays out. He plops down another plant, this one about 18 inches southwest of the gas construction buoy. Was he doing this to scale and maintaining real-world relative bearings? Lighthouse on Fisher's Island. Like a chess player. Stopped me for a moment. I thought, the lighthouse on Fisher's Island sound, but then they're actually on the island. They're two very near the island. I wasn't sure what tolerances we were working with here. I offered the one that was just off the western, Race Point. He looked to me and he said, no, Race Rock's not on the island. I said, okay. How about Dumpling? No, that's not a dumpling. Oh, anyway, lighthouse on the island, okay. Gas construction buoy. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a small unlined notepad, the type that you have grocery lists appear on. A pencil stub lay close at hand. I maneuvered the pad between the two tomato plants and handed him the pencil. He chewed on his cigar, then suddenly snatched the pencil. On one end of the pad, he made a dot. On the other end of the pad, he hesitated, he made another dot. I felt I was in at the moment in the history of cartography when the map was invented. I stared at the two dots and then stepped back to line them up in terms of the tomato plants. I also thought about the actual Fisher's Island sound, its points, bays, aids to navigation, though by now down in his cellar, such actual world items seemed rather fantastic. In between, he says. We now had a small pad of paper with two dots and a bench upon which, at either end of the dots, was stationed a tomato plant. I backed up and oriented the plants to the compass bearings I imagined would be there in the real world if we had a compass. I said, southwest to northeast. He reached into the chest pocket of his green and black shirt, and I thought, he's going to extract a Boy Scout compass. What emerged was a kitchen match. Here I thought we were going to get down to the very roots of technology, the very first technology, fire. The ancient Mediterranean sailor was about to share with me a Promethean moment. What he did was light the edge of the bench with a cigar. I said, compass course. I had only 2 years before studied navigation and piloting in the Coast Guard, 12 weeks, 5 days a week. I even passed the course. Nevertheless, I did not now expect loxodromic curves, some lines, soft iron magnetism, and annual deviations. But a compass, you must have a compass somewhere. No compass. You never used a compass. No compass. What about fog? Go slow. Thick fog. Go slow. Look around. Watch current. Sometimes maybe ducks. And you never got lost? You got to know where the duck is going. Now this hoopla about bells and guns and so forth, at the age of atoms and backwater Noank and so forth, well, a fuss about lobsters. I mean, aside from the tourists surging through our narrow lanes seeking abbots, lobstering is a passion these days may strike you as something akin to the collecting of Faberge Easter eggs. So I'll take a moment here to not give you a definitive wrap-up of what lobstering was like in Noank, but just to recall some things. First of all, we want to realize what yachting was at the time. I don't know, is Zell here? He's gone on the glass house somewhere, right? Well, Zell had a job up in the next door here. He was a scientist, so he liked to count things. And he looked out the window and he counted up, in the middle of summer, high summer, 29 boats in this harbor. The whole harbor, 29 at this time. Now, West Cove had no breakwater, had no over there. I had an old $200 Crisfield, Maryland sailing skip. I used to sail tack out of that West Harbor. Just shows you what was there or not there. Take 2 hours to get out to Mouse Island. Talk to Dorothy Kramer and her husband. Come back in about 15 minutes. The idea, the queen of the yachts in this town was Ed Maxwell's Avenger. Did you get a seat, Mark? Is he here somewhere? He was here. He's standing in the door. There you are. Right. Okay, it was Mark's job to keep this thing from sinking, right? And Ed Maxwell said that the only reason he could have the boat at all is because he owned a paint store, and he had the seam compound at a discount. But he won all the races in it. Now that was yachting. Now lobstering, on the other hand, first of all, you had George Maine's family, which is now fantastic over in West Cove. You had this idea that not too long ago, 50 barrels a day were going out of that railroad station. The Skipper's Dock menu, and it was still a restaurant down there, had in its menu all these little Noank lobster boats with the offset cabin and so forth, of which I had one. And then, of course, over here at the Yukon lab, there was always a big lobster project going. Before that had been a lobster hatchery. Let me say a few things about economics at the time. In spite of what I tell you in the story about my own career as a lobsterman, that year I made $4,500. Now you might think, yeah, you understand, that's a lot of money then. I'll tell you how much money it is. The next year I got to be a school teacher and I made $1,000 more. Last year I bought these ear things here, same price as the first year. Yeah. Okay. Now, the year before I moved down here, I rented what's now Oliver Porter's house. That's a nice big house, right? $75 a month. With that money going to buy the thing for $17,000. The house over here that I was living in, we got for $7,500. You could get a house for about $20,000 that you could actually live in. What did you pay for yours, Doc? 22 or something like that. Gretchen lives there now, yeah. I hope that's not revealing any sort of thing that's going to hurt you when you go to sell a house. The $20,000 house you could buy in Noank, even this one next door that Lloyd Bergeson lived in, what did that go for? Around 20, something like that? What did they pay for it? Around in there, that's what I thought, yeah. The Fisher's house, 20, no. Okay. The lobster boat I had over at Grant Long Point, $800 I bought on Christmas Eve up the road, a typical offset cabin sort of thing. You could feed a family of 3 at the Universal for $15 a week. 75 cents a pound at Grossman's for the lobsters, selling them, yeah. But for me, the most important thing, of course, was the embodiment of the true Noank thing was to get those lobsters out. The crux of the crisis seemed to be this thing of the run. Now, just what this run was remained a bit fuzzy. Was it like the alewife run, which is roughly a 2-week phenomenon, starting when the trees began to bud up on the Poquatonic and when the herring came in from the sea up to the Thames? Then you could fill the barrel merely by swinging a crab net along the edge of Crowley Brook and drinking Narragansett beer with the Pequots in the Brookside at day's end. In those days, everyone also understood that lobster season itself ran, as we said, from when the water temperature encouraged them to move out of their semi-hibernation in mud burrows through the summer until the August molt, when not only did they go back in hiding in their soft shell, but the worms came out and really did a job on your wooden pot, so you might as well pull them. There was also their movement in the summer to escape the warm shallows of Connecticut to the deeper, colder water in Fisher's Island territory, which your license would not cover, of course. And that was a fact that finally the Connecticut state legislature got onto, and why they withdrew their support for the next door as a lobster hatchery. So my question now was this moment in the life of Homerus Americanus that somehow coincided with the birth of our nation, and now the birth of the Noank Historical Society? According to my neighbor, the answer was yes, 4th of July. The lobsters ran, be there. Now, a more sophisticated answer seemed to me to might lurk in the chief structure of Noank under the hill, the former site of the State Lobster Hatchery, then the Marine Laboratory of the University of Connecticut, now the Shellfish Hatchery. Where there were a number of interests over there, the one that was getting the most attention was the Lobster Project. As a boy, I'd gone in there with my grandfather and cousins to turn in our eggers. A man would take the flapping female from my grandfather, mark its tail fin with a ticket punch, then toss it off the dock. For witnessing this spectacle, we were paid 3/4, easily divided among the 3 kids. Since I now lived across the street, it was easy to haunt the place, which despite its shift in management was pretty much the same place. Now, the driving force behind the Lobster Project was a young man as all we were, named Lance Stewart. He was one of the last of the rare breed of water rat and lab technician. He says, data on movement in the wild is very difficult to nail down. He's leaning up against the blubbering lobster tanks there. To understand any animal, you have to tag it somehow. You have to know for certain that it is the very same animal you were observing yesterday, See, most of us would just say, well, the lobsters ran. We saw the bluefish in Cherry Harbor, and now they're in the race, as if it's the same fish. It probably is, but that's not science, yeah. You have to tag them. And of course, the problem is that the lobster molts several times a year. What are you going to hitch the tag to? And then this business, he says, of the rising temperature and the 4th of July, who knows? In a moment of despair one night, he affixed a tiny transmitter to the carapace of a lobster and let it go off the dock, the one right next door there. He sat back with a receiver to capture the beat. It ran all right, he said, kept going all night, clear down to Latimer's Reef, like a dog with a tin can on its tail. Beep, beep, beep. Yeah, science. The next they tried was virtually babysitting the animals. For lobster watchers, Lance set up a relay of 3 graduate student divers, Howard Mickey Weiss, Tom McLaughlin, and C. Braxton Dew. Mickey went on to found Project Oceanography, and even more important, become a clarinet player in the Noank band. And Tom, of course, became the top fisherman after Ben. And Braxton Dew, believe it or not, became a bush pilot in Alaska. So these 3 guys are watching the lobsters all night long. What do they find? The lobsters don't go any further than just this space in here. So there was even a ringer scientist, this was so exciting, this whole project, from some lab away, I don't know where he's from. He had a theory, a hypothesis, that you could track lobsters by their color. And so by feeding the control group a diet exclusively of shellfish, he hoped to bring up those tiny blue flecks you see on the skirt of the carapace. They're there in a regular lobster, just tiny little blue iridescent things. The experiment caught the attention of the London Day, who sent over a photographer. Unfortunately, as I recall, the vibrant color of these beautiful blue lobsters also attracted predators, because lobsters are colored the way they are for a reason. They're not that beautiful blue because, over here, you're missing. Anyway, almost immediately, all the specimens that let go in the wild, gone. And so too was the professor shortly. Never saw him again or heard of him. I had to really think about what happened to all that. Well, Lance says, as for the 4th of July temperature somehow triggering a kind of Oklahoma Soomers land rush among lobsters, who knows? But hey, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have your gear over by then. By the way, what's holding you up? Trap production. Now, the morning of the 4th of July still had not gotten any pots overboard. It seemed the whole village was on a cresting wave headed for the newly refurbished Noank shipyard, where at 6 o'clock the celebration was officially to commence. The 4th of July, I was experiencing, I did not know how to ride that kind of fest. Everybody's just, couldn't do anything. Take out the garbage, don't have time. There's, this sort of thing. To try to catch up on this almost hourly acceleration, I thought it would be wise to delegate some of the carpentry to a young man whose parents had dropped him off one day when they saw me working in the gear. They seemed to find the scene irresistibly picturesque and in full concordance with their idea of what Noank should be like. The idea had been that this kid would apprentice himself to be an authentic Noank lobsterman, and so eventually transcend his bourgeois limitations. I demonstrated how to make a pot. Being a bright lad, he copied it perfectly. Then I made the mistake of turning my back on him to take on the stringing of bait. As I shoved the bait needle through the eyes, this is an ugly thing, of the alewife and dragged the string through, lubricated by the gore, I comforted myself with the sound of his rapid hammering, making lobster pots. When I looked up, he had completed a pot. Evidently bored by the standard double chamber of the traditional trap, he designed one with 3 chambers. Among the problems was that we now had a pot almost impossible to lift without straining something. I motioned to our models, the 2-chambered trap. Before I knew it, he had knocked out a single-chambered trap, which was, of course, no trap at all, but merely a box for a lobster to walk in, get fed, and walk out. Again, I pointed out the models, one of which he'd actually made. I was called away to the phone, and when I got back, what do we have but another breakthrough in lobster pot design, the L-shaped pot. The latest contrivance was a 2-chamber pot with a 3rd powder added on the end at a right angle so as to make an L. I did not have time to deliver a lecture on tradition and the individual talent, so at this point I merely suggested, why don't you knock off for the day? But not before helping me hustle that work around out of sight of the guy there. It made me very nervous because it's like having the Pope hovering over you, And the Pope, yeah. In honor of the 4th of July and in conformity with John Adams' Age of Enlightenment enthusiasm, I had a new pair of red and white striped pants. To my surprise, I was having trouble getting them buttoned. And the better to deal with this puzzle, I had retreated to the downstairs bathroom, which had recently been cobbled out of the old pantry just in off the kitchen. To fit the plumbing in and yet maintain a modicum of privacy, we had contrived a pocket door. It was declared a brilliant solution by casual visitors, but it didn't always rattle closed at the first or even third try. So there I was fighting the door in my pants when an elderly woman burst into the house and headed straight for the hall, right to the closet door. Her navigation was spot on. She must have been studying the plans for the house. She looked familiar, but I had trouble recognizing her because the right side of her hair was all unstrung and plastered flat and wet, and the other side was curled. My grandmother's phrase, "mad as a wet hen," occurred to me. "Mr. Jones, your son has just shot me in the head." I was none other than the founding president of the Noank Historical Society. My pants could rise no further than my knees. "You will have to excuse me, Madam President. I have no intention of doing any such thing, Mr. Jones. Just look at me." "Well, you don't seem to be bleeding, Mrs. Oliver." She was, however, streaming with water, which lent a lachrymose appearance to her usual cheerful appearance. I was on my own porch preparing my address for tonight's festivities. "I'm sure it'll be a grand affair, Mrs. Oliver. We all look forward to it." "Not with my hair looking like this, Mr. Jones. I was all day yesterday in the beauty shop." "Mrs. Oliver, I didn't even know he had a water pistol. Well, he must have purchased it at Carson's next door." "Well, Mrs. Oliver, I'm sorry he did this. It's most inappropriate." She said, "I don't take it personally. I was a school teacher for several generations here. I'm aware of that, Mrs. Oliver, and I think it only appropriate that you should be tonight's speaker." I was probably the first person he saw after he loaded up. You know how children are these days. Instant gratification. "I'm sorry these pants don't fit." I had now grabbed a towel, a case of grandiose judgment on my part. I shall endeavor to find another pair by the time you make your address." "Not with my hair this way." I thought of offering her a towel, but there's only the one. "I have a towel at home," she said. Must have been reading my mind. The minute she left, I found I could get the door shut. Now, my original plan had been to use my old lobster boat Osprey to set out the pots from Venetian Harbor, where Ernie Abbott did, and Bud Lathrop, another guy Mark knows, Lathrop engine guy. The problem was that they would be having this big fireworks festival over there, and I knew you couldn't get near the place with your vehicle, and even if you could get out of the harbor, you'd be downrange from where all the stuff would be falling in the water. So, with having to deal with my son's assassination of the president of the Noank Historical Society and having to find another pair of pants, I was running late. What seemed a solution was to employ the 10-foot dinghy Mrs. Kopp had permitted me to use a few doors down on Riverview Avenue there, Halsey's now. I took added comfort in the surmise that this was approximately the historic spot where my mentor, Tony, had moored his Sharpie. I loaded up my father's old mortar-encrusted construction company wheelbarrow, and with 3 traps, I trundled them from the backyard 2 houses down to the outhall. I eased them aboard the dinghy, and seeing there was probably room for more, I wheeled it back to the yard. There's plenty of daylight, and most of the town was all down at the Noank shipyard at the picnic. My mentor, however, was up on the balcony, and he watched silently, puffing his cigar as I loaded the single trap in the wheelbarrow. "I've got 3 more already aboard the dinghy. Figured that's probably enough. Don't want to overload the little boat. Better safe than sorry." I was going to sputter on with more wisdom, but he was slowly shaking his head. "You're never going to make the 4th of July." The spot I headed for was the far side of the anchorage, where Ram Island and its 2 satellites, Quick and Quirk, constituted the eastern bulwark of the harbor. The location had nothing to do with his tomato plant gas construction buoy ranges. I knew that no matter how eager I might be to follow in the footsteps, or in this case oar strokes, that would be impossible. The gas construction buoy at best was a temporary location, had by its very nature outserved its location, and no matter how fiercely it burned in my imagination, acetylene gas as a method of buoy illumination had been out of date for half a century. In any case, I didn't know where the place had been. But there ahead lay Quirk Island. It was the closest legitimate lobster ground that I could reach with a rowboat, or at least it was an area with which I was familiar. On the west and soon behind me was the long, low end of the Noank Peninsula, upon which the new Noank shipyard had come back to life after a couple of generations of desolation. If you want to see what it looked like, look in the Sherman's Market up there. There's a mural back of the MSC Berry as a schooner that was the way it was when the thing that you were talking about that very day in there. Yeah. But none was cleaned up, sort of. Donald Singer, God bless him, had made this available to the town for a place to have this picnic. So many people were coming down there that one of my friends who lived out here, he was counting the people coming in versus the people coming out. And he said, there's a lot more coming in than are coming out. I'm afraid the whole peninsula is going to. I'd been down there earlier to see the MSC Berry, show it to the kids. She was in there, as you pointed out. But now there must have been 1,000 people over there. They had the grill going, beautiful smells coming from there. But I had my Tony Pezzolesi imperative, which is as strong at least as John Adams about how to celebrate this, had to get those pots out there. I wondered as I rode across there if Mrs. Oliver had yet indeed addressed the multitudes and what technique she had used to make her hair balanced. It pleased me to see the spars of the Wet Well lobster smack, MSC Berry, honored guest, great tradition. I thought, that's what I'm doing. I was not, of course, carrying on this tradition at a very efficient pace. Loaded down to within a handspan of the gunwale, freeboard, I had to be gentle in my oar work, rowing more as if I were stirring soup than competing in the Yale-Harvard race. Having traversed the main channel, which ran tight to the village shore without encountering traffic, I was out among the anchored fleet on the flats. Now, the old photos show this area occupied by Noank sloops, the precursors to my Osprey, all of them wooden, gaff-rigged, wet well lobster boats. The present fleet was composed also of sloops, then a mere handful of fiberglass Marconi rigs, owned chiefly by out-of-towners who use them for weekend cruising and racing. So it's up to me to keep the lobster thing going. Now, before I had worked my way through the fleet, the sun had set, and the twinkling of the barbecue fires of the picnic to the west had replaced it. The band had struck up, or at least its rhythm section, bump, 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 which sounded not unlike twin diesels. As I emerged the far side of the anchorage, I was into the channel once again and needed to cross to get to Quirk Island. This time, I was not as lucky, and out of the dark arose the bow wave of a sport fisherman inward bound, its engines having replaced the picnic man. A shout from the passing fly bridge, and it occurred to me I was showing no lights as I wallowed in the wake of this twin-screw vituperation. On my regular lobster boat, of course, I had the proper lights and so forth. I also had more freeboard. Fortunately, I did have a bailer, and as I just interrupted my rowing to employ it when another big powerboat screamed past. What was the hurry? Did they know something I didn't, besides lights? The top on top shifted, but not quite overboard. I decided it would be best if I were to forego the bailing and put on speed to get out of the channel as soon as possible. I did take a moment to lean over the cargo and try to yank the errant pot back in the line, a task which I partially was successful at. By the next time the powerboat roared past, I was out of the channel, a position, while it proved no lead from the wake, at least saved me from the cursing of the boat operator, and for that matter, being run down. By now, I also had developed a way of parsing the sound of the picnic man from the engines so that I could see one or hear one coming and line the boat up so that I was headed into the wake rather than being broadside to it. The stink of the diesels began to thin as the water opened up out into the sound. The smell of the bait was losing out to the sheer power of the sea. I was now under the loom of Quirk Island, topped by the great square glacial erratic. It was atop this summit that at the turn of the 19th century, the soon-to-be infamous novelist Theodore Dreiser would sit. He had a rocking chair that he had brought, I think, from right about here. In the back of this one, it was a store. We have this in a different book. He bought a rocking chair out of here, took it out there, and put it up on that rock. So I'm thinking of that as I'm hiding down behind the rock. It would be at that time of night that Dreiser would expound to his housemates his tedious thoughts on man's insignificance and the indifference of the universe. And of course, it was that time of night that was happening right now. It's just this time of night right here. Below on the beach of Quirk Island, the bones of the old Ram Island lightship rattled liquidly in the last snarl of the passing wake. Dark, low cries and the whack of invisible wings, almost where I needed to be. The scent of the island's bayberry and brine fought with the stench of gull guano and lobster bait. Around the back of the island, I slid my first pot over. The boat rose gratefully. I was going to be all right. I would be rid of all this dangerous weight on my way home. Incidentally, I would have done what I set out to do. I let the boat drift aft on the ebbing current until what I judged in the thin ambient light be sufficient breathing room for my first pot, and slid over the second. As if in celebration, a rocket exploded over my head. You may wonder why it not occurred to me that this would happen. That given John Adams' admonition, the inaugural festival of Noank Historical Society would not celebrate in this traditional 4th of July fashion. Indeed, they had so advertised, endorsed by our own Historical Society president. But somehow in my mind there had been what we would now call a disconnect. Fireworks shooting out over the water, they did that at Groton Long Point, way far away. This was Noank. We had no track record for such behavior. I watched the debris fall out of the water after the glare. It seemed to be tending adequately beyond me, to the east, or so it seemed, but then the illumination failed. I was now absolutely black. My night vision had been knocked out by the glare. Added to the other odors, there was the smell of consumed explosives. People writing things like this like to say burnt cordite, but when I check this out, that's not what that really is. But I can say burnt cordite. Okay. That smell, that acrid smell, suddenly. Okay. Well, for something to do, I launched the next pot. I had only it splashed to tell me it was overboard. The explosion of the next rocket allowed my buoys revealed and placement of the third pot in the right sequence. Hey, good. I had 2 more to go and decided to work with their launching in with what of the pyrotechnics I was using it like flares. Once all of the pots were over, I was of course free to return to the shore, but to do so would mean to row through an uncertain fallout pattern of rocketry, the hissing of which I all heard about as it hit the water. My chief worry was that sooner or later some low trajectory job. There was always one of those misfires in even the most best regulated displays, that low corkscrewing shot that drew boos and catcalls from the gleeful crowd. There was no reason at all why that shouldn't happen to me right then. And what would it be like to be hit by burning phosphorescence? Wasn't that what they made these fool things out of? And well, whatever chemical it was, wasn't it the type that when immersed in water burned even brighter? Surely there was something that worked that way. Salt water, even worse. At such moments, one is the helpless grip of folk medicine and tabloid journalism. Wannabe lobstermen, maimed by festive fire. At least where I was, I could slink behind risers rocking erratic, and any falling on me would still not be incandescent. Meanwhile, I wondered about Mrs. Oliver. Had she known of my situation, would she have been sympathetic, or rather taken some grim rhetorical satisfaction in the justice of all this artillery returning her morning's outrage? And there are those craven forces even now lurking on the edges offshore of the more than Egyptian darkness to the east who must be repelled from our land. Now, if you know your Noank schoolmarms, you know that's not Mrs. Oliver. Where's Sutphen? That's Mary Virginia Morgan. The next day, she was making the speech up on Sylvan Street, and she sees this doctor and professor lurking on the edge of the crowd in their beards. And she says, there they are, cravenly hanging back at the edge of the crowd. God bless them. Jesus. Okay. So I'm thinking, they don't have an endless budget to shoot these things out here. Pretty soon they're going to run out of money. And then I'll go home. It was the 4th of July, the water was warm, and now that the boats had stopped screaming by, now I knew what they're trying to get in ahead of this, it was calm. The rhythm of the detonations was picking up. Was this the climax? I thought of my old high school algebra buddy, just sitting right over there. Scott Whipple. He's been over his desk with his twin Ticonderogas, performing his rudiments, as they call them, his double paradiddle flams, his Swiss Army triplets, his zigzagging rudimentons, and rim shots. In the meantime, it was pleasant just to sit there and even bail, and that was something I understood. The next morning, I was loading the rest of the pots into the pickup to take over to Groton Long Point's Venetian Harbor. The Pope was up on his balcony in his green and black. You still got that? You made her hold it. Okay. All right. green and black buffalo. I smelled the cigar. I knew it was southwest wind. 4th of July was yesterday. Indeed it was. You get anything out? Of course. That is, some. He turned his head back inside, but stopped with his hand on the open screen door. Over his shoulder. Where you put them? Quirk? Quirk? He made a face. Oh, I thought, that's the literary name. What my friends in the Noank Historical Society were insisting on lately. Construction boy! Gas construction boy! He goes back inside. And then he turns around one more time. He says, hey, you see any fireworks? Some. Few. Waste of money. Poof! All up in the air. All gone today. That afternoon, I went out from Grant Long Point in the old Osprey there, chugging back to Quirk at 6 knots with a Latham. Even though it was a clear day and the seas were calm, I could find nothing of the 5 pots I had so laboriously and dangerously sown the night before. Dreiser's rocking chair boulder looked down with cosmic indifference. Later, among the bubbling lobster tanks at the Marine Lab, I lamented to Lance Stewart. I says, God damn, stole my gear. He says, those are the new pots you're working on the yard, right? Yeah. Did you soak them before you set them? Soak. And what about the current that sweeps out the ebb around the north end of Ram Island with those 2 little hummocks there? Sweeps. You should maybe look down to the eastward, all the way to Latimer's. If they haven't fallen into a hole, you may find them. If they haven't fallen into a hole beyond your scope. Beyond my scope. Of course, that must have been it. My unsoaked tramps had gone out on the ebb, vanished. Surely as the gas construction buoy and the illuminations of the Noank Historical Society. All gone today. I need to get unplugged. This is a dangerous moment when people say Trumpian things because they don't know the microphone's on. Right, where's my techie?
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Oh. How you doing? Jeez. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Oh, gee whiz.
Enlightening enough.
Thank you. Where's my